The sitting is resumed.
Order number 1, in the name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225. The vesting in the home ownership providing energy Inc. HOPE, an acronym, Inc., of a parcel of land, the property of the state, situate Hanson Plantation in the parishes of St. George, St. Michael, and Christchurch in this island for housing development.
Senator Cummins.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I seek your permission to treat two items, number 1 and 2, on the order paper as a cognate debate.
Oh. The question is that the matters related to standing or items numbers 1 and 2, both related to vesting of land in Hanson Plantation, one to the HOPE Inc. and the other to National Housing Corporation, be taken as a cognate debate. Of course, we will vote on them separately. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Those against, please say no. The next ayes have it. Senator Cummins, please therefore proceed. And honourable members, you could make comments on both resolutions in the course of your debate contributions.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I don't propose to spend an extended period of time on these two items, Mr. President, because I believe that from the inception of this Honourable Parliament in 2022, that we heard, beginning with the throne speech coming from the President and subsequent statements made by the Prime Minister and the ministers with responsibility for housing, both of them as they have been over time, there has been a clear discussion shared with the public of Barbados about the vision of this administration for the provision of housing, in particular, access to housing for low-income earners in this country. We have heard, Mr. President, about the government's ambition to complete 10,000 houses by the end of the year, and in some instances, that number has even been higher. We have heard, Mr. President, about the number of persons who have historically, as recently as yesterday, Mr. President, I walked into my office and a lady stopped me en route and she said to me, "Minister, how do I get one of the houses that building?" And I said to her, well, this is what you have to do. This is the ministry that you go to. Here is where the offices of HOPE are located, and these are the things that you can do. And she spoke to me, Mr. President, about something that we have all heard at great length over the course of, I guess, growing up in Barbados, about the number of persons who have been on a list at the National Housing Corporation, not for weeks or months, but for decades in some instances. And so we have heard, Mr. President, the approach of the government of Barbados, first to scrubbing the list at the National Housing Corporation, because obviously after decades of persons being on the list, while that number may seem overwhelming and traumatic to look at, many of those persons either have had housing provided in some instances, or others unfortunately may no longer be with us. And so we have to actually have a clear number of how many persons are actually awaiting housing on the National Housing Corporation's list. But what we do know is that there are many Barbadians for whom housing is and remains out of reach. And so the government's program, in collaboration with both, on the one hand, the National Housing Corporation, and in other instances, the Urban Development Commission and the Rural Development Commission were applicable in urban and rural areas respectively. And now, more recently, Mr. President, the establishment of a commercial state-owned enterprise called HOPE, Home Ownership Providing Energy. And so the government's position, Mr. President, is that there are a number of pillars on which housing is to be provided on the basis of the narrative that we have shared and our ambitions to meet the targets of providing housing, in particular for low-income housing. The government has ensured that it has outlined what those pillars are. One of those pillars, Mr. President, is the National Housing Corporation. The second pillar we know of, Mr. President, is Central Ministry, where we have a number of Crown properties that are being refurbished, and of course, under Hope Inc., where public and private sector workers earning up to $4,000 a month will have access to housing. Now, the models for each one of these will be very different. And so you will see in this resolution, Mr. President, in the first instance, the vesting of approximately 8.046 hectares in the parishes of St. George, St. Michael, and Christchurch being vested in Hope for housing development. And then secondly, 8.353 hectares vested in the National Housing Corporation for the purpose of residential and commercial development. So these two vestings, Mr. President, are earmarked to meet the needs of the Barbadian public. Now, Mr. President, a few weeks ago, under the umbrella of the National Petroleum Corporation, and this is an interesting thing when you start to think about how the arms of government are interconnected. The National Petroleum Corporation falls under my remit as Minister with responsibility for energy. And we spent an extended period of time over the course of a day in places that I ordinarily have not necessarily been, and which required me to go off the beaten track to see what was happening. And we then were able to see not just what we expected, obviously, in terms of the natural gas pipeline, but we also saw a number of housing settlements where people had placed houses in places for which they had no permission, simply because in many instances, Mr. President, if I can walk into a commercial bank, if I can walk into a credit union, or if I can walk into the NHC and not remain on a list for an extended period of time and be in a position to have a legitimate right to housing, to house myself and my family, that I would not have some of the settlements that you see in parts of Barbados. And it is important for us not to speak from a position of privilege and a position of access to capital when speaking about persons who have neither privilege nor access to capital, but their needs are just as basic as ours are. And so they too need to ensure that there's a roof over their head and that they are able to provide for their families. And so it is the commitment of this government, this administration, and the leadership of the Ministry of Housing and Lands to ensure that housing is not just provided for, but is made available to and affordable to persons who are in a certain income bracket. Now, what does this mean for these two resolutions, Mr. President? We have, in the first instance, you have parcels of land that are meant to be vested in Hope. And I want to spend just a few moments talking about Hope because I've said before, I am very clear that all of us follow the news. We have been in this honorable chamber as senators for at a minimum a year. Some of us have been here for 5 years. And so we who are vested in policy making and have heard multiple speeches and statements, and I am expecting that we understand how the apparatus of government works, we are not unfamiliar with the government's housing program, and we are not unfamiliar with what is meant to be undertaken by these various agencies, Mr. President. So Hope, in the first instance, is using a model that is important, certainly to me, as Minister of Energy as well. If you pass down the road by Highway 2A, and you drive along the side that takes you down from Lancaster, Vesper Gardens, that is perhaps the one that is most visible and people see all the time. Very recently, I had a delegation visiting Barbados working with us on energy policy, and I took them to see a number of installations, whether they were solar or the projected sites for other types of projects, but I also drove them and took them to see the Hope project at Lancaster. And why, Mr. President? We have in that particular project an innovative financing model that allows persons who would ordinarily not be in a position to own a home because the price will be out of reach to use the provision of renewable energy by way of solar PV panels solar PV on their roof to be able to generate a return from the grid that then helps to capitalize and underwrite the cost of their home. That is an innovative financing model, Mr. President, that has been rolled out as part of a housing solution, working in tandem with a country that is transitioning to a net zero future, and ensuring that we, in so doing, make affordable housing available to people and also change lifestyles simultaneously. And when I say change lifestyles, Mr. President, it may mean in this instance that we are accustomed, because you know that the panels are on your roof, we're accustomed having to go into a commercial bank, for example, and say, well, I want 100% mortgage. I ain't got enough money, but I want 100% mortgage. I don't have the money to pay for it. This is what I need. Now we have a model that says, this is what the expected rate of return from your roof, from the feed-in tariff, based on the size of your system, is going to be. And this is the rate of return that you can get. And the check that comes from those PV panels on your roof on a monthly basis does not go to you as a net beneficiary, because you are not putting any money down in the first instance, but that money is going to the entity that has financed the house until it is paid off, and then it reverts to the homeowner, as is the case in so many other models. But in this instance, we're simply using energy. I am very proud of the creativity that went into fashioning this model to make homes available. And who are these homes targeting, Mr. President? You have people who walk the length and breadth of this country every day. When I walked into Parliament today, I was having a conversation with a police officer, and he said to me, I said, how are you going? He said, I'm good for now. I don't know how I can go be a little later on. I laughed and I said, I said, you got plans for later on? He said, in this job, later on is never guaranteed. Anything could change. I said, this is very true. So we have people who, while that applies to all of us, yes, but in particular, people who are on the front line, like our police officers, who walk the streets every day to protect us and keep us safe, but who, for many of them, a house like this is out of reach because of their income levels. And so those houses are earmarked to ensure that people like nurses who look after our families and our loved ones in the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, our teachers who educate our nation's children, and our policemen, those who are earning at that level of income, are able to afford decent housing of which they can be proud, and also be a part of our sustainable energy future. This is a model that we are then proposing, Mr. President, in this resolution, in particular the resolution at order number 2. Order number 2 on the order paper, is it? Let me just be absolutely certain, because I know we're treating this as a cognate debate, and I want to make sure that I'm speaking to both of them. Order number 1 is specifically being vested in the HOPE project, to ensure that we are able then to have housing solutions provided for these persons. Now, secondly, we have in the National Housing Corporation, and we have heard the Minister with responsibility for housing speaking about the work that is being done in the National Housing Corporation, and the work that, quite frankly, still needs to be done in the National Housing Corporation. It is not, at this point, a perfect institution. There is still a considerable amount of work that is needed to make the National Housing Corporation what it needs to be. And so the balance between central ministry, HOPE, and private sector partners, and we have seen over the course of the last several years, multiple tenders issued in the newspaper for contractors with the availability of capital and the skills to come forward and to bid for many of these projects. Now, this is what is interesting, Mr. President, and I am also speaking about this from a business perspective. When I was renovating my home, just like many of us in here, we go through not one or two or sometimes more contractors, because sometimes it can be problematic. Sometimes you pay for a service, or you have contracted for a service and that service is not delivered. Or they at times promise, overpromise, and underdeliver. And so you have a situation where, as a government, we needed to ensure that there was a clear balance between persons who are waiting on houses and wanted to be able to get into their homes. So there were persons who came forward and say, well, I have the capacity to build 250 homes at a dash because I have the labor, I have the skills, and I can deploy the manpower and the equipment all over the country. But there has to be space made in this administration at all times for smaller players. And so this administration invited persons who did not necessarily have the capacity to build 250 homes. We said, okay, come forward. If you have the capacity to build 5 or 10, you build those successfully, and then you're given more. We are entrusted with a few, and with a few, it translates into more. That helped to build capacity, it helped to build scale, and it helped to also make sure that there was the enfranchisement of large and small contractors alongside with the government as we built out these housing solutions. So everybody isn't always going to be able to be happy with the outcome. Sometimes you have some challenges where you may start and not finish. And when you don't finish, the person who is waiting on that home is rightfully incensed, and they want to be able to move into their home. And they're going to go to the government. And so the government is going to have to say, here's what needs to be done, and you either have to step in with a new contractor in some instances or try to resolve whatever issues are existing with the current contractor. So the government has not just sought to make housing solutions available using energy, in particular renewable energy solutions, but it has also sought to democratize the access to construction contracts by ensuring that there is a balance between large contractors and small contractors who can build homes for people. And once you have been able to successfully finish building the small number that you have been awarded in the contract, then you are able to build a further amount. That has been the balance that we have sought. But, Mr. President, that is not all. So aside from those persons who are challenged by the absence of housing in the first instance, or affordable housing as well, you have persons who live in their own houses who may not be in great condition, or in some instances, we have a number of persons, over 1,000 persons, if not more, whose homes were damaged by Hurricane Elsa. So the National Housing Corporation, in some of those instances, also has to step in and to provide temporary housing for those persons. That is a mammoth task in many instances, Mr. President, because you have heard in the other place, the honourable member who is the minister with responsibility for people empowerment speak about how for temporary housing, it is difficult for people to get access to housing because many landlords don't want to rent their houses to welfare clients. They don't want to rent their housing as part of a temporary housing solution while the government invests in the solutions for provision of permanent housing. So those are all challenges which the government is navigating and crafting solutions towards resolving. And so these two resolutions, Mr. President, in the first instance to vest the land in the Hope Inc., and secondly, to vest a second parcel of land into the National Housing Corporation are all part of the government's overall approach to housing and the provision of effective and affordable solutions to Barbadians. And so it is on this basis, Mr. President, as I said before, I don't want to make an extensive debate, certainly of my own contribution, and I would wish to open up the floor to hear from colleagues. And of course, in my response, I'm happy to respond to any queries that are raised from the floor. But this is the matter which is before the Honourable Senate. And with these few words, Mr. President, I beg to move that this bill now be read a second time.
Thank you very much, Senator Cummins. Speakers on these resolutions, orders number 1 and 2? There being none. Senator Cummins.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move that order number 1, to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Cap 225, the vesting in a Hope ownership providing energy, Inc., Hope of a parcel of land, the property of the state, situated at Hanson Plantation in the parishes of St. George, St. Michael, and Christchurch in this island for housing development do now pass.
The question is, order number 1, that is resolution to vest lands at Hanson Plantation into home ownership providing energy, Inc., Hope, Inc., that this resolution do not pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. It thinks the ayes have it. The resolution is now passed. Senator, sorry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I beg to move.
Mr. Jones.
Name name of the Honourable Leader of the Senate to move the passing of a resolution approving in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Chapter 225, vesting in the National Housing Corporation of a parcel of land, the property of the state, situate Hanson Plantation in the parishes of St. George and Christchurch in this island for residential and commercial purposes.
Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, I beg to move the passing of a resolution to approve in accordance with Section 5 of the Crown Lands Vesting and Disposal Act, Cap 225, the vesting in the National Housing Corporation of a parcel of land, the property of the state, situated at Hanson Plantation in the parishes of St. George and Christchurch in this island for residential and commercial purposes.
The question is that this resolution, order number 2, passing of a resolution to vest land at Hanson Plantation in the National Housing Corporation, do not pass. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. You think the ayes have it, this resolution is no pass.
We'd like to recommit reports from select committees.
Reports of select committees. Honourable senators, pursuant to resolution this morning, referring the matter concerning proposals for the establishment of 3 select committees, joint select standing committees. That was referred to the Standing Orders Committee. The Standing Orders Committee met and considered the matter. A report has been prepared which outlines the recommendations made pursuant to our standing orders and laying that report. That report will then be circulated, having been laid here today, and a specific resolution will be included in the order paper for our next meeting, in which the Honourable Senate will be invited to adopt the report of the committee, and at that time there will be the opportunity for full debate by the Honourable Senate on the contents of that report and a vote taken on the adoption of the report of the committee. The committee has fulfilled its mandate as given by the Honourable Senate earlier today and has made recommendations concerning insertions of a 60A and a 63A into the standing orders to support the establishment of these new committees into the standing orders and to outline their operations and functions. So be on notice that you will be circulated with this report, which is now being laid, and that the opportunity for full discussion on it will be at our next meeting. Senator Cummings.
Mr. President, this brings us to the end of government business for the day. I want to thank all honourable senators for their contributions today. And of course, I forgot earlier to mention that we are having our honourable member, John King, Senator John King, whose birthday it is today. And of course, we always appreciate when our members in the service of our nation spend their special days with us. So happy birthday, Senator King. I beg to move at this time that the Senate is adjourned until Wednesday, 17th of May at 11 a.m.
The question is that the Honourable Senate be adjourned until Wednesday, May 17th, 2023 at 11 a.m. Honourable senators in favour, please say aye. Aye. Those against, please say no. They think the ayes have enthusiastically have it. This Honourable Senate is therefore now adjourned.